The rain fell steadily against the wrought iron gates of the Whitmore estate. Rivulets ran down the ornate metalwork and pulled on the cobblestoneo zero driveway. Beyond the gates, the grand mansion stood illuminated against the evening sky, its warm windows glowing like beacons in the gathering darkness. Alexander Whitmore, 38 years old, stood in his study, reviewing quarterly reports that showed his technology company had exceeded all expectations once again. His dark coat hung perfectly on his tall frame, and his carefully styled hair spoke of a man who commanded boardrooms and shaped industries. Yet, despite his success, Alexander felt the familiar weight of loneliness that had settled over his life like a permanent shadow. The Whitmore fortune stretched back 4 generations, built on innovation and careful investments. Alexander had inherited not just wealth, but responsibility for hundreds of employees and numerous charitable foundations. At 38, he had everything society said should make him happy. Yet, he found himself increasingly isolated. In his grand estate, surrounded by staff, but starved for genuine human connection. The sound of the security buzzer interrupted his thoughts. Alexander frowned, checking his watch. It was nearly 8 o'clock in the evening, and he was not expecting any visitors. His housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson, had already left for the day, and his security team rarely bothered him unless something was truly urgent. "Sir," came the voice of his head of security through the intercom. "There is a young woman at the front gate. She is asking to speak with you at this hour." "What does she want?" "She says she would like to work, sir. She is asking if she can clean the house in exchange for food." Alexander's first instinct was to have security send her away. People approached him regularly with various requests, and he had learned to be cautious about strangers. But something about the situation nagged at him. Who would be out in this weather? Desperate enough to ask for work from a complete stranger. "Show me the security monitor," he said. The large screen in his study flickered to life, revealing the front gate camera. What Alexander saw made him pause. A young woman, perhaps in her mid-20s, sat on the wet ground just outside his gates. She wore a simple light blue dress soaked through from the rain, and her long blonde hair hung in damp strands around her face. In her arms, she cradled a small child who could not have been more than 2 years old. But it was not just the sight of a mother and child in distress that stopped Alexander cold. It was the woman's face. Even through the grainy security footage and the rain-distorted image, Alexander could see something familiar in her features that made his heart race with recognition and disbelief. "Sir," the security guard's voice crackled through the intercom. "What would you like me to do?" Alexander stared at the screen, his mind reeling. It could not be possible. After 15 years, after all the private investigators and dead ends, after he had finally given up hope of ever finding her again, the more he looked, the more certain he became. "Open the gates," he said quietly. "Sir, open the gates immediately and escort her to the front door. Handle her gently. She has a child with her." Alexander almost ran from his study to the grand foyer, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and fear. He arrived just as his security guard was helping the young woman and her child through the massive front doors. Up close, despite the years that had passed and the obvious hardships written on her face, there was no doubt. It was Emily. Emily Harper looked up as she entered the opulent foyer. Her blue eyes were wide with exhaustion and desperation. Water dripped from her soaked dress onto the marble floor, and she held her sleeping toddler protectively against her chest. When her gaze met Alexander's, her face went through a series of emotions: confusion, recognition, and finally shock. "Alex," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Hello, Emily," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "It has been a long time." Emily swayed slightly. Whether from exhaustion or shock, Alexander could not tell. He quickly moved forward and placed a steadying hand on her arm. "Please sit down," he said, guiding her to a nearby chair in the foyer's sitting area. "Jenkins, bring some dry towels and ask cook to prepare something warm to eat, and have Mrs. Patterson's room prepared for our guests." "Mrs. Patterson is away visiting her sister, sir," Jenkins reminded him. "Then prepare the guest suite on the second floor, the one with the adjoining room for the child." As Jenkins hurried away, Alexander knelt beside Emily's chair, studying her face in the warm light of the foyer. She looked older and worn down by circumstances he could only imagine. But her eyes still held the same gentle spirit he remembered from their college days. "Emily, what happened to you? Where have you been all these years?" Emily's eyes filled with tears as she looked down at the sleeping child in her arms. "It is a long story, Alex. A very long story. We have time," Alexander said softly. "All the time you need." As the staff bustled around bringing towels and preparing food, Emily began to tell her story. After college, she had married her longtime boyfriend, David, despite Alexander's quiet hope that she might choose differently. They had moved to California where David had promised her a better life. Instead, she found herself isolated from family and friends as David's drinking problem grew worse. "For years, I told myself things would get better," Emily explained, her voice breaking. "I kept believing that the man I fell in love with would come back, but he never did. He became violent and unpredictable. When I got pregnant with Tommy, I thought maybe a baby would change him." She looked down at her sleeping son stroking his dark hair gently. "It only made things worse. David saw Tommy as another burden, another expense. When Tommy was 6 months old, David disappeared completely. He took our savings, maxed out our credit cards, and left us with nothing." Alexander felt anger rise in his chest, but he kept his voice calm. "How did you end up here? I have been trying to make it on my own for over a year. I had a job at a grocery store, but when Tommy got sick last month, I missed too many days, and they let me go. We got evicted from our apartment 3 days ago. I have been staying in my car, but it broke down about 5 miles from here. Why did you come to my house specifically?" Emily's cheeks flushed. "I remembered reading about you in the business magazines. I knew you had done well for yourself, and I thought maybe you might need someone to clean or do yard work. I was not expecting you to recognize me. I just needed a job to feed my son." Alexander stood slowly, processing everything she had told him. The girl he had loved in college, the one who had chosen someone else, was sitting in his foyer with her child, desperate for basic necessities. "Emily," he said gently, "you don't need to ask me for work. You need help, and I'm going to give it to you. No conditions, no strings attached. Alex, I can't accept charity. I need to earn whatever you give me." "Then you can earn it," Alexander replied. "I have been thinking about hiring someone to help coordinate my charitable foundations. Someone who understands what it means to struggle, who can identify the people and programs that really need support. Someone with a good heart who will actually care about making a difference." Emily stared at him, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. "You would trust me with something that important? Emily, do you remember our senior year when you organized that fundraiser for the homeless shelter? You raised more money in 2 weeks than they usually saw in 6 months. And you did it not because it looked good on your resume, but because you genuinely cared about helping people. That was 15 years ago, Alex. Some things don't change," Alexander said firmly. "Your heart is the same. Your compassion is the same. The circumstances of your life may have changed, but the person you are at your core has not." Over the following weeks, Emily and Tommy settled into the guest suite at the Whitmore estate. Alexander insisted they stay in the house rather than finding separate accommodations. Partly for practical reasons and partly because he genuinely enjoyed having them there. The mansion felt more like a home with the sound of a child's laughter echoing through the halls. Emily threw herself into her new role with the same passion Alexander remembered from college. She visited shelters, food banks, and community centers, talking to people about their real needs and developing programs that addressed root causes rather than just symptoms. Her reports to Alexander were detailed and heartfelt, showing him a side of poverty and struggle he had never fully understood despite his wealth. Tommy, meanwhile, brought an energy to the estate that transformed the entire atmosphere. The 2-year-old toddled through the grand rooms with fearless curiosity, charming the staff and bringing smiles to faces that had grown used to the quiet formality of Alexander's solitary life. One evening, Alexander found Emily in the library reading Tommy a bedtime story. The sight of mother and child curled up together in one of the large reading chairs surrounded by centuries-old books and portraits of his ancestors struck him as both natural and deeply meaningful. "He is beautiful," Alexander said softly. Emily looked up with a smile. "He is my whole world. Everything I do is for him." "Emily, can I ask you something?" "Of course. Do you ever regret the choices you made? Marrying David, moving away, not staying in touch with old friends. Emily was quiet for a moment. I regret marrying someone who wasn't ready to be a husband or father. I regret not trusting my instincts when I saw the warning signs. But I can't regret the path that led me to Tommy. And I can't regret the experiences that taught me how to recognize people who really need help. What about us? Do you ever think about what might have been different if you hadn't chosen David? Emily met his eyes and Alexander saw a depth of emotion that made his heart race. Every day since I walked through your front door, she said quietly. But Alex, I'm not the same person I was in college. I've been through things that changed me. I'm a single mother with no money and a lot of baggage. You're one of the most successful men in the country. We live in different worlds now. What if I don't care about different worlds? Alexander asked, moving closer. What if I care about the fact that you make me laugh at breakfast? That you see solutions where I only see problems? That Tommy has taught me more about joy in the past month than I learned in the previous 10 years. Alex, I'm not asking you to make any decisions right now, Alexander said quickly. I'm just asking you to consider the possibility that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected places. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the same spot where he had first seen Emily through the security camera. This time, he was not alone. Emily stood beside him in a simple white dress while Tommy played on the lawn in his tiny suit. Family and close friends gathered to witness their wedding ceremony. As they exchanged vows under the same ornate gates where Emily had once sat in the rain, Alexander reflected on the strange ways life could surprise you. He had spent years searching for meaning in boardrooms and bank accounts, never realizing that everything he truly needed might one day appear at his gates in the form of a desperate woman with a child asking not for money but for the chance to earn her way. Emily's vows spoke of second chances, of learning to trust again, and of the difference between love and security. She promised to help Alexander remember that wealth meant nothing without people to share it with, and that the greatest success was measured not in dollars but in the positive impact you had on others' lives. As they kissed to seal their union, Tommy clapped his little hands and shouted, "Daddy, Alex." The guests laughed as the new couple beamed with joy. Later at the reception, Alexander's best man stood to give a toast. "I've known Alex for 20 years, he said. And I've never seen him as happy as he's been these past few months. Emily, you didn't just come into his life. You brought life into his life. And Tommy, you turned a house into a home." As the evening wound down and the guests departed, Alexander and Emily walked through the gardens of the estate with Tommy sleeping peacefully in Alexander's arms. The same rain that had brought them together was falling gently again, but this time it felt like a blessing. "Do you think he'll remember any of this when he grows up?" Emily asked. "He'll remember what matters," Alexander replied. "He'll remember that sometimes the best things come from the hardest times. He'll remember that home is not a place, but the people who love you unconditionally." Emily leaned against Alexander's shoulder as they walked back toward the house. She thought about the journey that had brought her from desperation at the gates to this moment of perfect contentment. Sometimes you had to lose everything you thought you wanted to find everything you actually needed. And sometimes asking for help was not a sign of weakness, but the first step toward a strength you never knew you possessed.